In this lesson, we're going to take a look at some nice new features in CSS3 for drawing rounded rectangle corners and drop shadows and a few new color management features. So, these examples are all in the project folders. First of all, we'll see how you can create rounded corners on shapes. I have here 3 divs, and for each div, I've set the border radius property. I'll show the code in a moment, but I'll just explain how it looks first of all. So in the top div, I've set the border radius property to be 20 pixels. That applies a border of 20 pixels on all 4 corners. And you can either specify the amount in pixels or as a percentage of the width or height of the shape. Now if you want to, you can define a different border radius on each corner. So the border radius property takes 4 numbers, where you can specify a top left corner of a certain radius. The top right has a more rounded corner. The bottom right is quite small, and the bottom left has no rounded corner at all. And finally, there are individual properties such as border top left radius, border top right radius, where you can specify each radius individually if you want to. Right, there you go. Let's have a quick look at the code. So, in my code, let me just skim down to the bottom. I have 3 divs, and each div has a different class, border 1, border 2, border 3. And at the top of my document, I've defined class styles. Border 1 has a radius of 20 pixels on each corner. Border 2 specifies 4 numbers for the top left, top right, bottom right, and bottom left. And then if you want to, you can set each border individually using specific property names like this. So that's rounded corners. Next thing we're going to have a look at is how you can do drop shadows. So there's a new property in CSS3 called box shadow. Box shadow takes 5 parameters. I'll show the last example first actually, because that shows all 5 parameters all in one go. So the first value here is the horizontal offset, the shadow. A positive number means go to the right. A negative number means go to the left. The second parameter is the vertical offset. A positive number means down. A negative number means up. The third number is the blur distance. So this gives you 20 pixels worth of blurring. You can define the color, and you probably do need to define the color for most browsers. And if you set the inset property, then that allows you to have an inset shadow. So you can see the shadows inside the shape here, as opposed to being outside. This example actually shows one more property. In this example here, we specified the horizontal offset, the vertical offset, the blur distance, and a spread distance. So that will give you 10 pixels worth of spread in all dimensions. So the best thing to do is to have a play with these figures and see what effect you get. I'll show you what the code looks like. This is the shadows HTML. So in my example here, similar to the previous example, I have a series of divs, and each div has a different class. And then at the top of the document, I apply different styles to those classes to illustrate the various capabilities. All the divs, as you might have noticed, have the common features. They all have the same background color, yellow. They all have a rounded border radius. And you might have noticed that if the shape has a rounded corner, then the shadow also has a rounded corner. So that's quite nice. Let's go back to the code. This is the general syntax for the box shadow property. I've already explained what those values mean. And this is what it looks like. So specify a negative offset, so the shadow goes to the left, and a negative vertical offset, so the shadow goes up. So we have an upset shadow there. On the second example, we have a positive value for the X offset to the right, and a positive value for the Y offset. So that will go down. So that looks more conventional. And then the third example, we have a blurriness, 20 pixels worth of blur. So you have a blur there. That's quite a nice feature. I quite use that quite a lot. The next example also has a spread distance. So for example, if I made that a very large number, let's make it 50 pixels worth of spread. And I'll go back into this file and refresh it. Whoa, we have a very spread out box shadow there. To be honest, I preferred it the way it was. And then finally, set the inset property for a shadow that goes inside, not outside. Next example, looking at color management. There are some new ways to specify colors in CSS3. You have an RGBA function where you can specify the redness, greenness, and blueness, either as a number from 0 to 255 or as a percentage, 0 to 100. The last number is the alpha number, or the opacity. This is a number between 0 and 1. 0 means transparent, 1.0 means completely opaque. So this shape is pretty much transparent. Next one, this one is used in percentages. So here we have a shape that's 100% green, but only effectively 10% opaque. So it's pretty much transparent. There's another function called HSL, where you can specify the first number here is the hue. That's, you can imagine a color wheel going from 0 to 360 degrees. 0 represents red. If you go 1/3 of the way around the circle, 120 degrees, that gives you green. If you go another third of the circle to get 240, then that gives you blue. Go back up to the top again, you're back to 0, and that's red again. So this is a color wheel. 240 represents blue. The second number is the saturation. How rich do you want the color to be? And the third number is the lightness. 90% means it's quite light. You have a number between 0 and 100%. And then finally, you have an HSLA function where you can specify the opacity as a number between 0 and 1.0. Okay, I won't bother showing you the code for that because you can imagine how it looks from the example here. One last example, there's a new property specifying the opacity. I have here a series of divs, and the bottom div has an opacity of 1.0, so it's completely opaque. And then as we go upwards, each div has an opacity that's gradually getting smaller until we get to the top one. You can't actually see it because it has an opacity of 0, which means it's completely transparent. Let me show you what the code looks like for that one. Opacity. So here are my divs. And for each one, we specify the background color as being orange. And then the opacity ranges from 1.0 to 0. So that's the end of this lesson. We've seen how you can draw rounded corners by specifying a border radius. We've seen how you can have drop shadows by specifying the box shadow property. We've seen various different color functions, such as RGBA and HSL, HSLA. And then finally, we've seen how you can define opacity to make things more opaque or more transparent.